Tigris River moved like black silk in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying with it the whispered prayers of 6 Navy SEALs who had been submerged beneath its murky surface for the better part of 4 hours. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reaper Davidson felt the familiar burn in his lungs as he held his breath for what seemed like the 1,000th time. His body pressed against the muddy riverbank, reeds tangled in his gear like nature's own camouflage net. The weight of his waterproof pack dug into his spine, but he dared not shift position, not when insurgent patrols had been sweeping the area every 20 minutes since midnight. Beside him, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, callsign Phoenix, remained, motionless as carved stone, her sniper rifle wrapped in waterproof fabric and secured to her chest. Even in the darkness, Davidson could see the intensity in her dark eyes, the way she tracked every shadow that moved along the opposite bank. She had volunteered for this mission when command said they needed their best marksman, and nobody had argued. Phoenix had earned her reputation in the mountains of Afghanistan, where she'd made shots that other snipers called impossible. But this wasn't about long-range precision. This was about survival, about holding position until their ride home came screaming out of the sky. The mission had started simple enough: infiltrate the compound, gather intelligence on the weapons cache, and extract, but intelligence had been wrong, dead wrong. What should have been a small outpost had turned out to be a major staging area, crawling with at least 60 hostiles and enough firepower to level a city block. They'd managed to plant the tracking devices and download the hard drives, but their extraction point had been compromised. Now they were stuck on the wrong side of the river with the entire insurgent network hunting them like bloodhounds. Petty Officer Jake Bulldog Morrison shifted slightly, his massive frame creating barely a ripple in the water. The team's demolitions expert had taken shrapnel in his left shoulder during the firefight at the compound, and Davidson could tell he was fighting to stay conscious. Blood had been seeping through the makeshift bandage for hours, turning the water around them a darker shade of black. Morrison's breathing had grown shallow, but his grip on his weapon never loosened. He'd die before he let his team down. They all knew it, and it scared them more than the enemy patrols. The youngest member of the team, Seaman Alex Ghost Rodriguez, pressed himself deeper into the reeds as another patrol boat's engine growled, to life somewhere upstream. At 19, Rodriguez was supposed to be back home in Texas, probably chasing girls and drinking beer with his high school buddies. Instead, he was here, holding classified intelligence that could prevent the next 9/11 if they lived long enough to deliver it. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his night vision goggles, the green-tinted world revealing too many moving shadows for comfort. Petty Officer First Class Danny Wizard Park had been monitoring radio chatter through his waterproof communications gear, his face growing grimmer with each intercepted transmission. The insurgents had called in reinforcements from 3 neighboring cells. Dogs were being brought in. Thermal imaging drones would be overhead within the hour. Their window of opportunity was closing faster than a steel trap, and everyone knew it. Park's expertise in electronic warfare had gotten them this far, but even he couldn't hack their way out of a 3-mile kill zone. The 6th member of their team, Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Maria Angel Santos, had been moving between the wounded, applying pressure here, injecting morphine there, all while maintaining the absolute silence that kept them alive. Her medical bag had taken a bullet during the extraction, scattering supplies into the dark water, but she'd managed to save what mattered most. Santos had patched up more SEALs than she cared to count, but she'd never lost one under her care, and she wasn't about to start now. As the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of gray, Davidson felt his heart rate spike. Dawn was coming, and with it, the end of their concealment. The thermal drones would spot their body heat signatures within minutes of first light. Their communications with base had been spotty at best. The mountainous terrain and enemy jamming made it nearly impossible to get a clear signal out. Their last confirmed transmission had been 6 hours ago, when they'd reported mission success and requested immediate extraction. Phoenix tapped Davidson's shoulder with 2 fingers. Enemy. Movement. Through the reeds, he could see them. A squad of insurgents moving along the far bank, weapons ready, eyes scanning the water. One of them pointed directly at their position and said something in Arabic that made the others laugh. Davidson's finger moved to his trigger guard, muscles coiling like a spring. If they were made, they'd have to fight their way out, and with Morrison wounded and ammunition running low, those weren't odds he liked. The patrol boat engine grew louder, and they could hear voices calling back and forth across the water. Searchlights began sweeping the riverbank, powerful beams that turned night into day wherever they touched. Davidson pressed himself deeper into the mud, feeling it ooze into every crease of his gear. He thought about his daughter's soccer game. The one. He'd missed to be here. He thought about his wife's face when he'd deployed, the way she'd tried to hide her fear behind a brave smile. Morrison's breathing became more labored, and Santos moved closer to him, her hands finding his pulse point. The blood loss was becoming critical, and they all knew it. In the growing pre-dawn light, they could see just how pale he'd become. His lips moved soundlessly, probably reciting the SEAL creed, the words that had carried them all through impossible situations before. But this felt different. This felt like the end of the road. The searchlight passed over their position once, twice, then stopped. Davidson could hear shouting, boots running along the riverbank. His grip tightened on his weapon as he prepared for what might be their final fight. Beside him, Phoenix had unwrapped her rifle and was tracking targets through her scope, her breathing steady and controlled despite the impossible situation. If they were going down, they'd take as many with them as possible. Then, cutting through the chaos of voices and running feet, they heard it, a sound that sent electricity through their exhausted bodies. The distant rumble of twin turbofan engines, growing stronger by the second. Davidson's eyes met Phoenix's, and for the first time in hours he saw hope reflected there. Their guardian angel was coming home, and she flew on wings of titanium and fury. The A-10 Thunderbolt II call sign Warthog 17 had been airborne for 3 hours, pilot Captain Jessica Viper Thorne pushing the aircraft's endurance to its absolute limits. She'd been running silent, hugging the deck to avoid radar detection, burning fuel at a rate that would leave her with barely enough to make it back to base. But she'd made a promise to those boys on the ground, and Viper Thorne never broke a promise. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon in her aircraft's nose carried 1,174 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium shells, each one capable of punching through tank armor like tissue paper. Today, she planned to use every single one. Captain Thorne's hands gripped the stick with the familiarity of a pianist touching ivory, but her knuckles were white beneath her flight gloves. The pre-dawn darkness had been her ally for hours, but now the eastern sky was bleeding crimson, and with the light would come surface-to-air missiles, radar locks, and enough anti-aircraft fire to turn her beloved Warthog into scrap metal. She'd been monitoring the SEALs' emergency frequency, catching fragments of their desperate situation. Through the static and enemy jamming, what she'd heard made her blood run cold. 6 of America's finest were about to be overrun, and she was their only hope. But there was something else gnawing at her, something that made this mission personal in ways her superiors could never understand. 3 years ago, Chief Davidson had been the one to pull her from the wreckage of her F-16 after she'd been shot down over Fallujah. He'd carried her unconscious body through 2 miles of hostile territory, fighting off insurgents with nothing but his sidearm and sheer determination. She'd awakened in a field hospital to find him sitting beside her bed, his gear still bloody, his eyes carrying the weight of the men he'd lost getting her out. "We don't leave anyone behind," he'd said simply when she tried to thank him. Now it was her turn to prove those words meant something. The intelligence briefing had been sparse, but Thorne had spent hours studying satellite imagery of the area, memorizing every building, every tree line, every possible approach route. She knew the SEALs would be near the extraction point, a bend in the Tigris River where the banks provided cover and the water was deep enough for submersion. What she hadn't expected was the sheer number of hostiles converging on the area. Her thermal imaging system was lighting up like a Christmas tree, showing at least 80 contacts spread across both sides of the river. As she approached the target area, Thorne caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip a beat. There, silhouetted against the dawn sky, was the distinctive outline of a Russian-made SA-18 shoulder-fired missile system. The insurgents had serious hardware, and they knew how to use it. Her A-10 was tough, built to survive direct hits from anti-aircraft fire, but a well-placed missile could still bring her down. She'd have to be smart, fast, and more than a little lucky. Warthog 1-7 to Reaper Team, she transmitted on the encrypted channel, her voice cutting through the static like a blade. I've got eyes on your position. Looks like you've got company. Lots of it. What's your status? Davidson's voice came back weak and broken. Viper. Thank God. Morrison's hit bad. They've got us surrounded. Thermal drones inbound. We've got maybe 5 minutes before... The transmission cut off as enemy jamming intensified, but Thorne had heard enough. 5 minutes wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the twin turbofan engines respond with a surge of power that pressed her back into her seat. The A-10 wasn't built for speed, but it could move when it had to, and right now, every second counted. Below her, the Tigris River snaked through the landscape like a silver ribbon, and she could see the muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the insurgents closed in on the SEALs' hiding place. Patrol boats were moving upstream and downstream, their searchlights sweeping the banks methodically. It was a coordinated assault, the kind of tactical precision that spoke of professional military training. These weren't just local fighters. They were dealing with foreign advisors, possibly Russian or Iranian special forces. Thorne's targeting system began acquiring locks on multiple contacts, but she hesitated. The SEALs were somewhere in that maze of reeds and mud, and one wrong shot could turn a rescue mission into a friendly fire disaster. She needed to get closer, needed to make contact with Davidson's team to coordinate the attack. But as she descended, her threat warning system began screaming. Missile lock detected. The SA-18 operator had been waiting, patience personified, and now he had a clear shot at the American warplane. Thorne saw the smoke trail streak up from the far bank, the missile's seeker head locked onto her aircraft's heat signature. Years of training kicked in as she deployed countermeasures, chaff and flares filling the air around her aircraft like deadly fireworks. The missile, confused by the thermal decoys, detonated harmlessly 50 meters to her left, but the explosion rocked the A-10 and sent shrapnel clattering against her armored cockpit. Not today, she growled, banking hard too. Avoid a second missile that painted a white contrail across the dawn sky. Her finger found the trigger for the GAU-8 cannon, and she lined up her first target, a technical vehicle mounting a heavy machine gun that was pouring fire into the reeds where her SEALs were hidden. The Avenger cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, sending a stream of 30mm shells downrange at 3,900 rounds per minute. The technical simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a cloud of smoke and twisted metal. But as she pulled up from the attack run, Thorne's heart nearly stopped. There, rising from the riverbank like something out of a nightmare, was the distinctive shape of a Soviet-era ZSU-23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. The Shilka was a tank hunter's worst enemy, capable of throwing up a wall of 23mm shells that could shred an A-10's titanium bathtub in seconds, and it was turning its 4 barrels directly at her. The enemy commander had been smarter than she'd given him credit for. This wasn't just a random patrol stumbling across the SEALs. This was a trap, carefully orchestrated to draw in American air support and destroy it. The weapons cache the SEALs had been sent to investigate was bait, the whole operation designed to lure in a high-value target like her A-10. She'd flown straight into an ambush that had been weeks in the planning. Time seemed to slow as the Shilka opened fire, streams of tracer rounds reaching up toward her like deadly fingers. Thorne threw the A-10 into a diving turn that would have torn apart a lesser aircraft, feeling the G-forces crushing her into her seat. Shells whistled past her, canopy close enough to count, and she could hear impacts on her aircraft's armored hull. The Warthog was living up to its reputation, absorbing damage that would have downed any other plane, but she knew she couldn't take much more punishment. Down in the reeds, Phoenix had been tracking the Shilka through her rifle scope, calculating wind speed and distance with the cold precision that had made her legendary among her peers. The anti-aircraft gun was too heavily armored for her .338 Lapua Magnum rounds to penetrate, but she didn't need to destroy it. She just needed to blind it. The Shilka's radar operator was visible through an open hatch, his attention focused on the A-10 dancing overhead. It would be an impossible shot for most snipers, 800 meters, moving target, high wind, but Phoenix had made impossible shots before. She exhaled slowly, feeling her heartbeat steady, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet took 1.2 seconds to reach its target, during which time Phoenix was already working the bolt and acquiring her next shot. Through her scope, she saw the radar operator slump forward, his hands sliding away from the controls. The Shilka's radar dish stopped tracking, its deadly accuracy reduced to wild spraying. It was the opening Thorne needed. She rolled inverted and dove straight at the anti-aircraft gun, her cannon spitting death. The 30mm shells punched through the Shilka's armor like it was made of paper, and secondary explosions lit up the dawn as ammunition stores cooked off. But even as she savored the victory, her fuel warning light flickered amber, then red. She was running on fumes, and the nearest friendly airfield was still 200 miles away. The trap had been sprung, but it had caught more than the enemy had bargained for. Now it was time to finish what they'd started. What happened next would be talked about in classified briefing rooms for decades to come, a story that would become legend among the special operations community. As the burning wreckage of the Shilka cast dancing shadows across the riverbank, Chief Davidson made a decision that went against every tactical manual ever written. Instead of waiting for extraction, he was going on the offensive. "Angel, how much time does Morrison have?" Davidson whispered into his throat mic, his eyes never leaving the enemy positions that were now scrambling to regroup after losing their primary air defense. Santos checked Morrison's pulse again, her fingers finding the weak but steady rhythm beneath his clammy skin. 20 minutes, maybe 30 if we're lucky. The bleeding's slowed, but he's going into shock. We need a medevac now, Chief. But Davidson was no longer thinking about extraction. He was thinking about the intelligence packet secured in his waterproof pouch, satellite photos, communication intercepts, and detailed plans for a coordinated strike against American forces across the entire theater. The mission to investigate the weapons cache had uncovered something far more significant. The enemy had been planning their own D-Day, a simultaneous assault on 15 NATO bases that would cripple coalition forces in the region. That intelligence was worth more than their 6 lives, but only if it reached command. "Wizard, can you get a clear transmission through their jamming?" Davidson asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. Park's fingers danced across his equipment with practiced precision, but he shook his head grimly. "They've got us locked down tight, Chief. Professional-grade stuff. This isn't local tech. I might be able to punch through for 30 seconds, maybe less, but I'd need a massive distraction to overload their systems." Above them, Thorne was fighting her own battle against physics and time. Her fuel reserves were critically low, and she could see at least 40 more contacts converging on the SEAL's position from the east. But as she climbed for another attack run, her enhanced optics picked up something that made her blood freeze. There, hidden beneath camouflage netting in a grove of date palms, was the distinctive silhouette of a Russian-made 9K-33 OSA surface-to-air missile system, a box score in NATO terminology. Unlike the shoulder-fired weapons she'd been dodging, this was a radar-guided monster capable of reaching out and touching aircraft at 30 kilometers. The system was just coming online, its massive radar dish beginning to rotate with mechanical precision. In 60 seconds, maybe less, it would have a lock on her aircraft that no amount of chaff or flares could defeat. She had one chance to take it out, but it would require getting closer to the ground than any sane pilot would attempt. Threading. The needle between the SAM's minimum engagement envelope and the murderous crossfire from small arms below. "Reaper, this is Viper," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the impossible situation. "I've got eyes on a box score system coming online. If that thing gets a lock, we're all dead. I need you to paint me a target with your laser designator. Biggest, baddest concentration of bad guys you can find. I'm going to give them something to remember." Davidson understood immediately. Thorne was going to use herself as bait, drawing the enemy's attention while he marked targets for her precision strikes. It was a suicide mission disguised as tactics, but it might be their only shot. "Phoenix, you still got eyes on that missile system?" Through her scope, Phoenix could see the OSA clearly now, its crew frantically working to complete their startup sequence. The system's armor was too thick for her rifle, but she noticed something else: a fuel truck parked just 20 meters away, probably there to power the missile system's generator. If she could rupture that truck's tank and Thorne could put a tracer round into the spilled fuel— "Chief, I've got an idea, but it's crazy even for us," Phoenix whispered, her crosshairs settling on the fuel truck's main tank. "That box scores. Got a tanker truck for support. If I can punch a hole in it and Viper can light it up, the explosion might take out their whole position." It was the kind of plan that would either save them all or get them killed in spectacular fashion. Davidson looked around at his team, Morrison barely conscious but still gripping his weapon, Rodriguez trembling but ready, Park working his electronic warfare magic, Santos preparing for the fight of her life, and Phoenix steady as a rock with impossible shot lined up. They were the best America had to offer, and they were about to prove it. "Do it," Davidson ordered, simultaneously activating his laser designator to mark the enemy command post that had been coordinating the attack. "Viper, you've got multiple packages incoming. Phoenix is lighting up your secondary target in 3, 2, 1. Phoenix's rifle spoke with authority, the .338 Lapua Magnum round punching through the fuel truck's aluminum tank like tissue paper. Diesel fuel began spraying in a high-pressure arc, coating the ground around the missile system and soaking into the sandy soil. The enemy crew, focused on their radar screens and missile preparations, didn't notice the growing puddle of combustible liquid spreading beneath their feet. Thorne saw the laser designation appear on her heads-up display and immediately understood the plan. She rolled the A-10 into a diving attack that would take her through a gauntlet of small arms fire, but would put her in perfect position to ignite Phoenix's fuel trap. Her cannon was loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Perfect for the job at hand. The enemy commander, realizing his carefully laid trap was falling apart, made a desperate gamble. Instead of waiting for the OSA system to achieve full operational status, he ordered it to fire immediately, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for a quick shot at the diving A-10. The missile leaped from its launch rail in a bloom of orange flame, its radar seeker struggling to maintain lock on Thorne's aircraft as it jinked and weaved through the anti-aircraft fire. But the commander had forgotten about the fuel spreading beneath his position. When Thorne's incendiary round struck the diesel-soaked ground, the explosion was visible from orbit. The OSA missile system simply vanished in a fireball that rose 300 feet into the morning sky, taking with it the enemy's command post, their communications equipment, and their carefully coordinated assault plan. The SAM missile, deprived of guidance, went ballistic and impacted harmlessly in the river. But the victory came at a cost. The explosion's shockwave caught Thorne's A-10 just as she was pulling out of her dive, and she felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel peppered her right engine. Warning lights cascaded across her instrument panel, like a Christmas tree, and she could feel the Warthog losing power. "Engine fire. Right side," she reported calmly, going through her emergency procedures with practiced efficiency. The A-10 could fly on one engine, but with her fuel already critically low, every mile was now precious. She had maybe 10 minutes. of flight time left, and the nearest safe landing zone was still 50 miles away. On the ground, the SEALs were already moving. The enemy's command structure had been decapitated, their air defenses neutralized, but there were still dozens of fighters scattered across the area, and they were angry. Morrison, revived by the adrenaline of combat, struggled to his feet with Icor Santos supporting him. "Not leaving without a fight," he mumbled through gritted teeth, his demolitions training kicking in as he spotted an opportunity. The enemy had positioned several patrol boats along the river to prevent escape. Morrison pulled out his last 2 blocks of C4 explosive, shaped charges that he'd been saving for the weapons cache. With Santos helping him stay upright, he began rigging an improvised river mine, a pressure-activated device that would turn the next patrol boat to pass over it into scrap metal. "Wizard, how's that communication window coming?" Davidson asked as he laid down suppressing fire on an insurgent position that was trying to flank their location. Park's equipment was smoking. From overuse, pushed beyond its design limits, but he was getting results. "I've got a partial carrier wave, Chief. Maybe 15 seconds if I can overload their jamming with everything I've got left. But I'll burn out my gear in the process. It's a one-shot deal." 15 seconds to transmit the intelligence that could save thousands of American lives. It would have to be enough. Davidson pulled out the waterproof pouch containing the classified documents and began preparing the data burst that would change everything. Above them, Thorne was making her own impossible calculations. Her damaged A-10 was dying around her, systems failing one by one, but she still had 1 card left to play. Her external fuel tanks were nearly empty, but they could be jettisoned and used as improvised weapons. If she could time it right, drop them into the remaining enemy positions and then ignite them with her cannon. It would be the kind of stunt that would either earn her a Medal of Honor or a court-martial. Probably both. What followed in those final 7 minutes would be dissected by military strategists for generations. A perfect storm of courage, desperation, and split-second timing that turned certain defeat into legendary victory. As Thorne's crippled A-10 limped through the sky, trailing smoke and losing altitude with each passing second, she made a decision that redefined the meaning of close air support. "Reaper Team, this is Viper. I'm going Winchester on everything I've got left," she transmitted, her voice carrying an odd note of serenity that chilled Davidson to the bone. "Tell me you've got that intelligence ready to transmit, because I'm about to give Park the biggest electromagnetic distraction in the history of asymmetric warfare." Below, Park's jury-rigged communications array was literally melting from the abuse he'd subjected it to, but he was getting a carrier signal that penetrated deeper into the enemy jamming network with each passing second. His hands flew over, controls that were too hot to touch, leaving his fingertips blistered and bleeding, but he could feel the breakthrough coming. "Chief, I need 90 more seconds to crack their encryption. Whatever Viper's planning, it better be spectacular." It was then that Rodriguez, the youngest member of their team, spotted something that changed everything. Through his night vision scope, he'd been tracking the remaining enemy forces when he saw them. A column of civilian vehicles approaching from the south, headlights cutting through the dawn gloom. But these weren't insurgents. They were families, fleeing the violence, women and children packed into trucks and cars, heading directly toward what was about to become the most concentrated battlefield in the region. "Chief, we've got civilians inbound from Sector 7, Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with panic. "At least 30 vehicles, maybe more. They're going to drive right into this mess in about 4 minutes." Davidson felt his heart drop into his boots. Everything they'd planned, Thorne's final desperate gambit, the intelligence transmission, their own fighting withdrawal, it all depended on unleashing maximum destruction across the entire area. But now there were innocents in the mix, and SEALs didn't compromise on protecting non-combatants. Not ever. "Viper, abort your attack run," Davidson ordered, knowing he might be signing their death warrants. "Civilians on deck. Repeat, we have civilians in the target area." There was a long pause before Thorne responded, and when she did, her voice carried a weight that spoke of impossible choices and the burden of command. "Reaper, I copy civilians on deck, but if I don't take out these remaining positions, those families are going to drive into a kill zone anyway, and if that intelligence doesn't get transmitted, thousands more innocents are going to die when they hit those NATO bases." It was the kind of moment that defined careers and haunted dreams. Thorne could see the civilian convoy through her targeting system, their vehicles meandering along the only road that offered escape from the violence behind them. She could also see the remaining insurgent positions, 3 heavy machine gun nests, 2 mortar teams, and a squad-sized element moving to intercept the SEALs. If she didn't act, the civilians would be caught in crossfire. If she did act without perfect precision, she might hit them herself. Phoenix, still pressed into the reeds with her rifle trained on the enemy positions, made the call that saved everyone. "Viper, I can guide your strikes with sniper fire. Give me your externals and I'll walk your ordnance right into their laps. But you've got to trust me. I mean, really trust me." What Phoenix was proposing was beyond dangerous. It was insane. She would use her sniper rifle to mark targets by shooting at them, giving Thorne reference points for her cannon fire in real time. It required the kind of coordination and trust that most military units never achieved after years of training. Together, they were going to attempt it with a pilot they'd never worked with, while under fire, with civilians 4 minutes away and running out of time. "I trust you with my life," Thorne replied simply, and banked her dying A-10 toward the first target. "Light them up!" Phoenix's first shot took out the machine gunner on the northernmost position, her .338 Lapua Magnum round creating a distinctive muzzle flash that showed exactly where Thorne needed to aim. The A-10's cannon followed 2 seconds. Later, 30-meter shells obliterating the position with surgical precision. The second target was closer to the approaching civilians, too close for comfort, but Phoenix adapted, putting her round into the mortar tube itself, the distinctive metallic clang audible even over the gunfire. Thorne's shells followed, turning the mortar position into twisted scrap metal. Meanwhile, Morrison had finished rigging his river mine and was already working on his next demolition project. Despite the blood loss that had Santos constantly checking his vitals, the explosives expert had identified a critical vulnerability in the enemy's defensive line. A fuel depot that they'd been using to support their vehicles was positioned perfectly to create a fire break. If he could detonate it at just the right moment, the resulting blaze would screen the civilian convoys' passage while simultaneously cutting off the insurgents' escape routes. "Angel, I need you to help me get to that depot," Morrison whispered, his voice growing weaker but his eyes still sharp with professional focus. "Can't let those families drive into hell." Santos didn't hesitate. Supporting Morrison's weight, she began moving through the reeds toward their target. Her medical training telling her that her patient should be unconscious by now, but her experience with SEALs reminding her that these men redefined the possible when lives were on the line. She had enough morphine left for 1 injection, just enough to keep him functional for the next 10 minutes. As they moved, Park achieved the impossible. His communications array, now literally on fire, punched through the enemy jamming network like a hot knife through butter. "Chief, I've got 15 seconds of clean transmission. Send it now." Davidson transmitted the intelligence burst in a compressed data package that contained the enemy's entire operational plan. Target lists, timing sequences, unit dispositions, and command structures. 15 seconds of crystal-clear communication that would allow NATO forces to preempt the largest coordinated assault since the beginning of the conflict. As the transmission completed, Park's equipment finally surrendered to the abuse, dying in a shower of sparks and melted circuits. But they weren't done yet. The civilian convoy was now 3 minutes away, and the remaining insurgent positions were repositioning to use the families as human shields. It was a tactical nightmare that required a miracle solution, and that miracle came from the most unexpected source. Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the enemy's movements, suddenly spoke up with the confidence of a much older warrior. "Chief, I've got an idea. What if we don't fight them? What if we join them? What the young SEAL proposed was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of engaging the remaining insurgents, they would infiltrate their ranks during the chaos of the EUAM's civilian convoy's passage. In the confusion, with smoke and dust obscuring visibility, 6 American special operators could blend in with the enemy fighters long enough to get close enough to eliminate the threat from within. It was the kind of plan that could only work if everything went perfectly, which meant it was exactly the kind of plan SEALs specialized in. Davidson looked around at his team, Morrison barely standing but ready to fight, Santos prepared to patch them up on the move, Park clutching a pistol since his technical magic was exhausted, Phoenix already calculating angles and distances, and Rodriguez with the eager intensity of youth facing its first real test. "Gear up," Davidson ordered. "We're going to war." Thorne, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle with physics and determination. Her A-10 was dying around her, systems failing in cascade, but she could see the civilian convoy approaching the danger zone. She had 1 external fuel tank left and just enough cannon ammunition for a final burst. It would have to be enough. As the families drove unknowingly toward disaster, 6 Navy SEALs emerged from the river like avenging angels, their weapons ready, their mission clear. Behind them, a wounded A-10 pilot prepared for her final act of heroism. Ahead of them, an enemy force that had underestimated what Americans would do to protect innocent lives. The battle for the Tigris River was about to end, but the legend was just beginning. In the space of 7 minutes, they would prove that some fights are worth everything, and some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. The families in. Those vehicles would never know how close they came to driving into hell, or how 6 warriors and 1 pilot redefined the meaning of never leave a friend behind, to include people they'd never met but swore to protect. As the sun finally crested the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Davidson keyed his radio one final time. "All stations, this is Reaper Team. We are going weapons free. God help us all." The last chapter of their impossible mission was about to be written in smoke, fire, and the unbreakable bonds of warriors who understood that some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth living for. The SEALs held their breath one last time, and then Captain Jessica Viper Thorne's A-10 Thunderbolt roared across the river at first light, carrying with it the fury of angels and the promise that freedom is never free, but it's always worth the price.